Hello.
Professor Papanek needs no introduction in Pakistan. Professor Papanek, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
And before we start, Nadim, could I just please say hello to everybody? This is Anita Weiss from Eugene, Oregon. And Gustav, I haven't seen you for so long, but it's nice to see you here.
Oh, yes, indeed.
And
Yeah, great. Anybody else?
many years.
Anybody else wants to say hello to Professor Papanek? Please do so, then we can begin.
And also, hello, Nadim.
Hello,
Thank you.
Professor Papanek.
Okay.
This is Talat Anwar.
Okay.
So I was professor at Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, and I worked as advisor in the Planning Commission of Pakistan as well.
Okay.
5 years ago. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, Professor Papanek, let's begin the conversation.
Okay.
We are so glad to have you with us. You have influenced Pakistan enormously, and for that we are grateful to you. We've known your name for, and at least my lifetime I've known your name, and everybody's known your name. So we would like to learn as much as possible from you about your Pakistani experience, and in particular to learn something about our economic history, because it's seldom written up, little understood. And I will urge my colleagues after this interview to try and record as much of it as possible so that we can compile a brief bio and including your experiences in Pakistan, so that we can record them for everybody. So it's the intent of this video or this conversation is really to learn from you. So let me begin by asking you, Professor Papanek, just tell us about your educational background, how you began, and how your career went from education to coming to Pakistan. So let's begin with your early career, about who Papanek is, what did you do when you were young, how were you, where you were born, etc., etc.
Oh my goodness. That's a long time ago. I was born in Vienna, in Austria.
Austria, okay.
Yeah, and my parents were both socialists. My father was an active member of the Socialist Party, at one point head of the youth organization of the party. And we had a short civil war in Austria in 1934, which the socialists lost. And my father had to go into exile when I was 8 years old. And he stayed in exile for 4 years. We saw him during summer vacations only. He was condemned to death in absence, so he couldn't possibly come back. When Austria became part of Nazi Germany, when the German army marched in and annexed Austria to Germany, my mother, who was a physician and who had supported us, because my father had very little income while he was in exile, her position became untenable, and it became dangerous for us to remain in Austria. And fortunately, my father knew the Prime Minister of France, who was a fellow socialist, and so we got visas to join my father in France. When the French lost the war, the armistice agreement required them to turn over to the Germans anyone who had been a German, an Austrian, a Czech. They were going to require the French to turn over to the German police any opponents of the Nazi regime. So again, we had to flee the country, and we came to the United States. We had no money. We lived on charity for a short period of time. And I then quickly graduated from high school and left my family because I wanted to support myself, and I went to work as a farm laborer. I'm one of the few development economists who's ever worked on a farm. Uh, I was paid $18 a month, which I all saved up in order to pay my tuition at college. My parents, of course, could not support me at college. So I saved my money and went to Cornell and became an agricultural undergraduate, and then went to Harvard for my PhD. After I finished my PhD, in the meantime, I was in the US Army.
Oh, okay.
In the Second World War, I volunteered for the US Army and spent 2 years as a soldier. I then started working at the US Department of Agriculture, but that was a very depressing place to be because our main job was to persuade American farmers to grow less food.
Grow less food.
Yes, because the surplus was bought by the U.S. government, and the U.S. government had huge stockpiles of everything: butter, eggs, wheat, uh, rice. There were big stockpiles, and so the government was interested in having less grown, so they wouldn't have to buy so much. And I didn't think that was a very attractive life task, to persuade farmers to grow less food when there were many hungry people in the world. So when the US government set up an aid program, I transferred from the agriculture department to the aid program. And I became chief economist for Asia. I was chief economist because I was the only economist. So by definition, I was chief economist. And I spent 2 years in the aid program. It was a wonderful part of my life because we were inventing what to do. Nobody had any good idea of how you help countries to develop. And working on Asia, which was the biggest part of the aid program, was very exciting. But then came the McCarthy period. The Republican Party gained power for the first time after many years. And of course, McCarthy was a Republican. And he had said that the State Department was full of communists and incompetents. So they decided to do something about this, but it was very hard to do anything about the main State Department. But the aid program was a new program. It was separate. So what they did was they abolished the program, which meant all of us lost our jobs. And then they established a new program, and they hired only the people they wanted to hire. And I lost my job. And I went to see the security man to find out whether it was because I was an incompetent or a communist. And he said, no, there was no indication that I was a communist or that I was incompetent. But the problem was I had socialistic tendencies and I had too much social conscience. And that was the bad thing. So that is why I was fired. And so I had no job, and I had 2 small children. My wife also had a PhD. So, some of you know her, but she couldn't work at the time because we had two small children. So I went back to Harvard and said, "Can you help me find a job?" And they said, "We're just putting together an advisory group for Pakistan. And we have many excellent members, but none of them know anything about Pakistan. So we'd love to have you join the team because you're the only one who knows something about Pakistan. In fact, many of them didn't know where Pakistan was."
Had
So
you been to
how I-
Pakistan before that or not?
that is how I came to Pakistan.
Okay. But had you been to Pakistan before that, or you just started?
No.
No, you had. Okay.
No, but I had been responsible for the putting together the aid programs for Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka.
So when was this that you joined the Harvard program? What
That was
you're talking 1950,
54.
54, and the US aid was in that was closed down in 52 or 50 what 51.
The U.S. aid program had started in 1951. Yes.
Okay. But we heard that the Ford Foundation was heavily involved with Pakistan before US aid came in, and that you were also a consultant with the Ford Foundation.
Well, no, at that time, when I came to Pakistan, I had nothing to do with the US government. I had been fired from the US government. Our team was supported by the Ford Foundation.
Okay. So when you came to Pakistan as part of the Harvard Advisory Group, tell me, how did it start? What did you do to begin with? What are the first program that you initiated? What are the first interventions that you designed?
Now, I think it's very important to realize how difficult the situation was in Pakistan.
Mhm.
The country had virtually no industry.
Mhm.
Manufacturing was 1% of the national income.
Mhm.
I think there was one textile mill in West Pakistan and 3 jute mills in East Pakistan. That was all. Pakistan was considered a country of peasants and soldiers.
Mhm.
Um, in 1955, I went to India to see how planning was done there. And I met with the Planning Commission, various members of the Planning Commission, and several of them told me they believed that Pakistan would be rejoining India before very long because it was not a viable state.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, they said it has no industry. Not only that, it has nobody who has experience with industry. It has no bankers.
Mhm.
Uh, it has very few administrators. It's
Mhm.
a country that cannot survive. It was basically producing cotton for the mills in Bombay and Ahmedabad and jute for the mills in Calcutta and Howrah. Um, and so they believed, which of course I thought was totally not sensible. Pakistan would never rejoin India, but they believed that it wasn't viable.
Mhm.
And we came to the Planning Commission because it had no Pakistani economists.
Mhm.
There was no single person there who had
Mhm.
a PhD in economics.
Mhm.
There was one agricultural economist, Shafi Niaz, uh, but he was an agricultural economist. And it's not the same thing as a general economist. So Zahid Hussain, who headed the Planning Commission, was not happy to have a bunch of foreigners working for him at first. He didn't trust us, I don't think. He would have liked to have had Pakistani economists, but there weren't any. So gradually, we were able to work out a good relationship with him and the other staff of the Planning Commission, because we established very early on we were not working in the interests of the US government. We were working in terms of the interests of Pakistan. And we were willing to do whatever it took to help. So one of the first questions we had to learn is what was happening in the country. There were no good statistics on some important issues. We didn't know what the rate of investment was. However, people in Pakistan turned out to be very sensible and flexible. And economic incentives worked extremely well. Pakistan had a small group of traditional merchants. They were mainly trading domestically grains and other staples. And they were mostly small scale. There were a few larger ones, but mostly small scale. And everything was imported. Industrial goods were imported from India. Pakistan did not produce matches or soap or kitchenware. Everything was imported from India and was paid for by exporting cotton, jute, and some grains. And then came the conflict, the first conflict with India, when India devalued its currency from 3.3 to 5.2 rupiah to the dollar, and Pakistan refused to devalue its currency. And trade between the two countries came to a halt. So all of a sudden, all the imports that had come from India of manufactured goods were no longer available. So these traders had to learn to become importers from other countries. But it was very profitable to do that, and they quickly shifted to becoming importers from other countries. But then Pakistan did not have enough foreign exchange, and it became scarce and was rationed by way of import licenses. So it became more profitable to produce some of these goods in Pakistan itself. And when I later did a survey of industrialists, I found out that the rate of return on producing some of these industrial goods was 50 to 100%. That's pretty good, isn't it? I mean, in 1 year, you will earn back half or all of the investment you have made. So if you invested in industry, you became very wealthy. And this group of traders became industrialists, in a short time, much shorter time than anybody believed possible. And they were very thrifty. They took these high profits and invested them in more industry. A small story. We had a good friend who was the chairman of the stock exchange in Karachi. And he came for dinner, and at 10 o'clock, he looked at his watch and he said, "I'm very sorry. I have to go because at 11 o'clock, I call my manager in East Pakistan to discuss problems at his factory and other issues." And we said, "Why do you have to do that at 11 o'clock? And he said, "Because the rates are cheaper." Now, this was a man who owned 2 planes. He flew himself. He was a fair-sized industrialist. The few rupees he saved by calling at 11 o'clock were a tiny amount of money, but he was still trying to save every rupee he could to invest in more industry. Now, of course, the consequences of this was that a few people became very rich. And income distribution was very unequal. One other step Pakistan took, which was very smart, many countries develop industry behind high tariff barriers, as Pakistan did, but they then they can be quite inefficient because they're highly protected. Pakistan took the next step. It went into the export business by providing high subsidies if you exported through the export bonus voucher scheme. And so Pakistan went from producing no industry to industry to exporting. And they became Pakistan became a major player in textiles in the world market. So when I went to Indonesia in 1970, they complained about those efficient Pakistanis who dominate the market in textiles and make it impossible for Indonesians to develop their own textile industry. So Pakistan achieved really a remarkable progress from 1954 to 1965. And then came the war with India. Most of the Pakistan tank corps was destroyed, and new tanks had to be bought, and tanks are expensive, and development came to a crashing halt, sadly. So I want to stop and see what else you would like me to talk about.
Let me ask you, when you initially started working on Pakistan, as you said, in terms of industry, in terms of human capital, in terms of many things, we were almost down to zero. But what were the initial sort of discussions amongst you, the Harvard people, the Pakistani people, what are the kind of models that you discussed, the economic theories, ideas that you discussed? How did you come to the point where you started planning? Because planning was started by, am I right, was started by the Harvard Advisory Group?
Uh, 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 the, our job was to help produce the first 5-year plan. Yeah. And one big issue was, should Pakistan develop a steel mill? Now, India had invested heavily in developing its steel industry. And there was the view, which was based on the Russian experience, that steel was crucial to development. Because if you had steel, you could produce machinery. If you produced machinery, you could produce machinery for further industrial development. Is that the way Pakistan should go? And there was strong political pressure for developing a steel mill and following the footsteps of Russia and India in that respect. And we argued against that because Pakistan, unlike India, had no coking coal and no iron ore. So we said, yes, if you produce steel, you no longer have to import steel, but you have to import all the ingredients for steel, coking coal and iron ore particularly, and you have to hire foreigners to run that steel mill because nobody had any experience with the steel mill. We said that money should rather go into a fertilizer plant because Pakistan had surplus natural gas, which could be converted into nitrogenous fertilizer and would help develop agriculture. This became a big issue, and people in favor of the steel mill said we were just trying to keep Pakistan backward. We brought out Hollis Chenery, who was considered an expert in this field, to look at this question, and he examined the cost-benefit ratio for steel mill and fertilizer plants, and it was clear that since Pakistan had the raw material for fertilizer, but not the raw material for steel mill, it made more sense to develop the fertilizer plant. That was one big issue. I remember that somebody in favor of the steel mill, he was not an economist, but he wrote an op-ed in Dawn, I think it was, which he ended with, "Good or bad, steel mill must be had." So there was this was a major issue. Which direction should industrial development go? A minor issue was in planning was whether Pakistan should use an input-output table as the basis for planning. The argument against it was that there was simply not the data available to create a sensible input-output table at that stage. But by that time, there were some Pakistani economists who had come back and who knew about input-output tables. This was the latest and most widely discussed innovation in economics. And so they said, let's have an input-output table as the basis of planning. You can't do it otherwise. So again, we brought out Vasily Leontiev, who was the man who developed the input-output table. And he looked at the situation and he said it would be a waste of manpower to work an input-output table because the data were not available. So when Vasily Leontiev said that, that was persuasive. And we used a very simple, we had very simple, if you can't even call it a model. It was an, you related output to investment, and investment was dependent on Pakistani savings plus foreign aid. And that gave you the increase in GDP that would result. It was very primitive, but it was what we could do based on the data that were available. The other big issue, the really big issue, was the share of government resources that should go to East Pakistan. There was constant conflict on that issue, which contributed to the breakup of Pakistan. There was a group of East Pakistan economists centered on PIDE. I'm just going to hang that up. Centered on PIDE that pointed out that East Pakistan was getting fewer government resources, and especially in relationship to its population, and was getting very few import licenses, even more crucially. You couldn't develop without import licenses because Pakistan was not producing the machinery needed for new investment in industry. And the control of import licenses was in the hands of people from West Pakistan, and it was quite deliberately the allocation was made larger for West than for East Pakistan. When Hussein Shahid Sohrawardi became prime minister, he very quickly, he was a very smart man. He was the first prime minister from East Pakistan who came with the support of the Awami League and of the East Pakistani elite to Karachi. And he very quickly saw the importance of import licensing. And he started to take steps to change the ratio of import licenses to West versus East Pakistan. And And the moment he did that, he was overthrown. What do I do? I have to answer it because otherwise they think I'm unconscious, but I'm on another line. Please call later. So that was a major event. It led to the people in East Pakistan concluding that they could not get a fair share as long as they were part of Pakistan. Because the moment somebody tried to change the ratio of import license allocations, they would be overthrown.
Can I interject a question here? We also heard that there was another issue that agriculture was supposed to deliver a surplus to be given to the urban sector. At the same time, East Pakistan was supposed to be invested in less compared to West Pakistan because the rates of return were higher in West Pakistan. And this is attributed to the Harvard Advisory Group, that the first plan was based on these two notions, and that's what set in motion this process. Is that correct, or is that?
Well, yes and no. First of all, I think it is a mistake to think that we made the major decisions. The major decisions were made by Zahid Hussein, who was a remarkably able person and a patriot, and who, as I said at the beginning, was quite suspicious of us, but came to rely on us for technical advice. But he still made the decision, and he still dominated what was in the plan document, which led to his ouster. It was the notion that that agriculture was to be to produce a surplus, which would be invested in industry. Well, yes, in a sense that was true. If you were going to have industry in Pakistan, it had to be financed somehow. And since the country was basically an agricultural country, the financing had to come from agriculture. But the foreign exchange had to be earned by agriculture. But we were strongly advocating that agriculture should continue to grow, to become more productive. That was the advocacy of the fertilizer plant was in order to provide fertilizer for agriculture that did not have to be imported and would therefore be more readily available given the shortage of foreign exchange. We always had an advisor on agriculture who worked with Shafi Niaz to get agricultural productivity to increase, so that the notion that agriculture was simply to be exploited and squeezed is correct in one sense. That is that they had to produce the foreign exchange and resources to invest in industry, but it was not correct in another sense, that it wasn't a stagnant agriculture that was simply to be.
Let me raise another question, Professor Papanek.
Yeah.
You also
Can
wrote.
I also ask a question?
एक मिनट बाद में पीटी बाद में basically you wrote a book called Social Goals and Private Incentives.
Yes.
And you were kind of playing around in that book between the market economy and the socialist economy, so to speak, or the command economy. But basically, Pakistan adopted a planning model with a closed economy and with rationing and with import licenses and all that. Now, with hindsight, do you think Pakistan should have gone a different way, should have opened out to begin with, and should have liberalized the economy to begin with?
I didn't.
My question is related. So can I also ask?
PT, इसरा chaos हो जाएगा. 2 minute आराम से कर ले.
There is a chapter in that book, Gentlemen at Work. Ask about that also. It's about civil service.
आ जाएंगे उस पे आ जाएंगे. Okay, go ahead, Professor. Go ahead, Gus.
I didn't quite get the question whether a different strategy would have been more sensible. But what would the different strategy have been?
If we had had a more market-oriented strategy, if we had a more liberal, open strategy as opposed to a planning strategy, which is based on import controls and rationing and
yes, I would think some more open economy might have been better. But in fact, Pakistan used economic incentives very imaginatively. There was a period of tight import licensing, which gave unearned profits to those who handed out import licenses and those who received import licenses. And that was unfortunate because it provided the wrong incentives. I remember being taken around Dhaka by a government official, one of the civil servants who had a CSP, who had high prestige and at one time a fair salary. And as we came by a small shop, tiny shop front, and he said, that shop belongs to I can't remember whether it was his brother or his nephew or his cousin. And he earns 10 times as much as I do because he has an import license for medicines. And all he does is buy the imports at the official exchange rate because he has the import license, and sell it at the free market rate because that's what medicines command. And he earns a huge profit with no effort on his part whatsoever, except that he has to pay half of the gains to the civil servant who gives him the import license.
Good. Okay, let's ask PT. PT, go ahead, ask your question.
I'm sorry, so that would have been
PT.
shortly thereafter, Pakistan introduced the export bonus voucher scheme. It became that used market incentives to get industrialists to shift to exporting. And I think um, Pakistan succeeded in moving from no industry to an export industry uh, in extremely short period of time by distorting market incentives. If you had left it to the market, it would not have been as profitable as it was, and the process would have taken longer. I think market incentives are effective, but they may have to be, and they were in this case, distorted, if you will, by government action to make them stronger and to provide the strong incentives for people to do what was in the interests of the country, which was to develop rapidly an industry. Industrial development was at the highest rate in the world at one point. Pakistan was a real success story between 1958 and 1965. And if you had left it entirely to the market, it would not have been as fast as it was.
Let me ask you another question, then we have to throw it open to the floor. You also, just because there were no economists in the country, you also set up a program for training economists. And many of the good economists in Pakistan were created by the training overseas. People like Mahbubullah, people like Aziz Ali Muhammad, many people were trained overseas. And there was a Harvard Public Administration program that is also set up for civil servants. Even today, Pakistanis go there. And then also you went to Boston and created a lot of Boston graduates who now still, people like Ishrat and Hafiz, etc., are all graduates from your school. So in a sense, you've created a whole generation of Pakistani economists. How do you feel about them? And what do you see their role in Pakistan, and how are they playing the game vis-a-vis the civil servants? And if PT is back, he can interject his question too. I don't know whether he is or not. So go ahead, Professor Papanek.
Well, yes, I have felt all along that the training of economists in the United States or in the West more generally was designed to produce academics. Yeah, especially at the highest level of training, that is at the doctoral level. When you got a PhD, you then became an academic. So if you had a PhD from Harvard, you might become a professor of economics at Swarthmore or at University of California. If you had a PhD from Boston University, you would become a professor somewhere else at a lower tier of education. But economists were playing a major role in government. They weren't being trained to perform that role. They weren't trained to deal with a great deal of uncertainty. They were trained, it's said that if you ask an economist how he would pick an apple from a tree that is beyond his reach, and his answer would be, assume I have a ladder. That economists deal with theory and assumptions. which are often not realistic, that you need a different kind or somewhat different kind of training for economists who are going to work in governments, because you can't make assumptions. You have to deal with the world as it is, and it has distortions that you need to take account of. For instance, I have estimated that in Indonesia, there are 23 million workers in the labor force who are surplus in their activities in which they are. That is, in economic terms, their marginal product is close to zero. They contribute nothing because they are the fourth shoe shiner on a corner where all the shoes can be shined by two, but therefore they are because the other two can't find any other jobs. So you have surplus labor. If that is true, then if you can employ these people in activities which contribute to output rather than in activities which do not contribute to output, you can gain huge increases in the national income and in the well-being of these people, because the informal sector pays about a third what the formal sector pays. So as you move people from informal to formal sector occupations, their income increases, becomes more steady, they get fringe benefits. So
let me bring in some people. There are lots of people who want to ask you questions, lots of your old friends. So let me bring
one sentence. So you need a training for people who are going to be working as highly trained economists in governments and international institutions. And that's what we were doing at BU. And there are a bunch of BU trained people still working in Pakistan.
Minister is one. Minister, Finance Minister is a BU trained person.
Yes.
Hafiz,
And Ishrat Hussain.
absolutely, there are lots of them. So let's bring in Pervez Tahir, former Chief Economist of Pakistan, wants to ask something. Pervez Tahir.
Hello, Professor Papanek, greetings. I met you in Mr. Hassan Zahir's room, your friend. I just heard you talking about economists who did not understand the nitty-gritty of the economy of Pakistan. I also read your chapter in your book. The chapter was entitled Gentlemen at Work. So were the likes of Mr. Hassan Zahir better practical economists in your view at that time? Because we have now suffered them for a long time. I would like you to comment on how were they then. Now, the less said, the better.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat your question if you don't mind?
Let me paraphrase it. Basically, what he's asking is that the civil servants were in control of the economy at that time because there were no economists at that time. And because the civil servants generally were more practical decision makers, etc., and you worked with them, were they better than the economists in terms of making this, the right policies and the right plans?
I thought the civil servants, that is the CSP, who controlled all important positions, did a remarkable job. They were, first of all, 95% of them were honest. And everybody knew who the 5% were. And on the whole, at the initial period, they were not given responsible positions, the 5%. So that was a major asset, their honesty. They were also um, they were also able. They had been picked through, as you know, through a process of um, selection that really worked to select people on merit. The problem is, of course, that they knew nothing about the fields which they controlled. So they would head the ministry of, they would be the secretary for the Ministry of Health, but they knew nothing about medicine. Um, they would be the secretary of the Ministry of Agriculture, but they may not know anything about agriculture. The idea was that they were able people and management was management, and it didn't matter what the subject matter was. This worked out well sometimes, but not so well at other times. And it depended to what extent technical knowledge was important. And in the early days, the civil servants had very little knowledge of economics. So they believed they could make economic decisions without knowing anything about economics. And one of the recommendations that Zahid Hussein made in the first 5-year plan, which led to his ouster, was that technical people should be added to the CSP at an appropriate level, not just at the entry level, but at the higher levels, so that we're in technical ministries and agencies, there would be a CSP who knew something about the subject matter. So this was one of the 3 powerful institutions on which caused this ouster. And now this is less of a problem because they don't run anything anymore, which in some ways has resulted in problems.
Let me bring in another friend of yours from Harvard, Professor Papanek. You might remember Khalid Ikram. Khalid Saab, Khalid Bhai. Khalid Ikram. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't think you can hear me. Khalid Ikram. You remember Khalid Ikram? Khalid. I don't think he can hear me. Okay, no problem. Manzoor Saab, you wanted to ask something? Go ahead.
Where is he there?
He is there, but he's not, unfortunately, able to hear me. I don't know why. Manzoor Saab, you want to ask a question?
Can I ask a question?
Khalid Saab, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think the strategy suggested by Professor Papanek in the 60s, 50s and 60s was very successful, mainly because, strategy turned out to be successful because they moved from low industry to high industry. And the GDP growth rate was very high at that time, around 6% per annum. And most of the target of plans, 5-year plans were met. And the essence of the successfulness was mainly because of the fact that the strategy was designed in the interest of the country. Because at that time, country had no resources, no industrial base. So the industry was highly protected. That was the basis of the success of it. And what happens later on, And I think that the strategy was successful mainly because of the fact that it was an protected era. The industry was highly protected in the world at that time. There was a protection, but later on what happened that, we have liberalization era when, most of the, industry were liberalized. And as a result, we have, so many adverse effect on the industry. And, what we see now and what we have been seeing uh, over the last 30 years that, after every 5 years, we have a balance of payment crisis, mainly because of the thing that everything has left on the market. So that is the main reason. So Professor Papanek, what would you suggest now to Pakistan in the, present time, that what type of industry we should adopt? Thank you.
I, I I am sufficient. I'm sufficiently out of touch um, with current developments in Pakistan, so I'm very reluctant to say anything about that. Um, uh, I am not, unfortunately, I'm not sufficiently arrogant to think that I know the answers when I don't know the data or the questions. Um, but look, the Pakistan now faces a grim situation, as do all countries that are relatively poor, because the growth in the world economy is going to be slow. In fact, it's going to be negative, right? So the demand for export for goods from all countries will decline. There will be terrible competition for the in the markets that will remain open. But Pakistan had at one time a very efficient textile industry. That was successful in exporting to the world market. I don't know what has happened to it. Uh, is any part of it still nationalized?
No, it isn't. And Professor Papanek, I think quite frankly, the way we look at it is that the rent-seeking model was established very early on in Pakistan. The early success of the industry kind of died out very quickly after the, Bangladesh left. And thereafter, we've been struggling with our exports and our industries. We've been in about 20 fund programs, and we can't seem to get out of our stabilization problem. Our long run growth is declining. So somewhere in that model, there was a problem, and that's what we wanted to talk to you about. How do you identify the problem that was set in motion when the Harvard Advisory Group was here?
I would like to come in.
Yeah, I can go back to 1965, which is when the rapid growth came to an end. And it had nothing to do with any economic model. It had to do with the need seen by the government of the day to divert huge resources to replenishing the destroyed military equipment, the military equipment that was destroyed during the war. There are, the country had only limited resources, like any country. No country has unlimited resources. If you divert government revenue principally to purchasing and foreign exchange, which is even scarcer, you divert it to the purchase of military equipment, then it is not available to purchase other equipment or to spend on other government programs. And that's what set the country back at that time. It wasn't due to any model, it was due to the decision which followed inevitably. If you're going to compete, to even have a chance of competing with a country whose economy is 4 or 5 times bigger than yours, you have to spend large sums of money. And those are then not available for other expenditures. And
but quite frankly, what happened, Professor Papanek, is that we have developed a license Raj now.
economists give, if you are spending large sums of money that are unproductive in terms of the growth of the economy. I mean, that's a decision a country has to make. What is most important? Growth may not be the most important objective. It may be national sovereignty, and you're willing to spend the money to sustain that. But I don't think that has anything to do with now the other major step that set back Pakistan was the nationalization under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's government, which led to people running enterprises who had no competence to do so. And which didn't benefit the poor at all.
Sure. Okay, Professor Papanek, shall I take another question? Ali Salman, you want to say something? Istiqbal Mehdi sir?
See, Dr. Nazimul Haq, thank you. This is Ali Salman.
Okay, first Ali,
So,
and Istiqbal Mehdi sir. Please raise your hand out here so that I can follow who's wants to ask. Ali, go ahead.
So Professor Papanek, going back to the history, when you described that Pakistan had no manufacturing base and no industrial base, and this is the history we are more familiar with. But I have an alternative understanding of the role which wealthy families and the private capital played at the time of foundation of Pakistan. So in 1940s already, the private families owning banks, airlines, shipping lines, insurance companies were all moving into Pakistan, and they were supporting the state of Pakistan also. So the first airlines, Orient Airways, was a privately owned airline, which was then taken over by government in 1956 to be called later Pakistan International Airways. Pakistan National Shipping Corporation was actually a nationalized version of a private shipping company, which was built by Cowboys. So there are many examples in these huge capital intensive sectors, which we see private capital was there, but then the government and the license Raj and then later nationalization, I think, destroyed that private initiative and the organic growth of the market in Pakistan, and allowed the state to intervene too much, created distortions, and then Bhutto's nationalization really killed the economy. So this is how my understanding of the economy, but of the economic history. But I think this is different from how you described.
Okay. Fair enough.
Your comment.
Well,
नदीम साहब मैं भी पूछूंगा.
जरा एक सेकंड बारी बारी करना बस को. Go ahead, Gus.
do you want me to respond? There were enterprises that were set up in the expectation that Pakistan would be realized, but they were not significant in industry itself. They were more significant in transport. And at independence, I'm sorry, there was only a handful of factories in Pakistan. The nationalization of some of these enterprises did not result in a deterioration in their service. The airline was at one point, when it was run by the Air Force, a very efficient and safe airline. Public enterprise can be relatively efficient, in my view, in those sectors where competition is difficult or impossible. At that time, you couldn't have two airlines. You could barely afford one. So it was going to be a monopoly in any case. And whether it's a publicly owned monopoly or a privately owned monopoly, it can be efficient if the management is under pressure to be efficient, or it can be inefficient, whether private or publicly owned, because it is a monopoly, and there's no competition to assure that if it's not efficient, it goes out of business.
Professor Papanek, this is Istiqbal Mehdi. I've already introduced myself to you earlier this evening. My question is related to public corporate sector. You know, Pakistan has a very unique experience of success and failure. If you recall, in 1950s and 60s, we had one of the reasonably well-run public sector, when we had corporate sector like PIDC, like RABDA, and all that. I'm sure you remember all of them. I know you well enough that everything is on your fingertip. Then comes the time of nationalization, as you mentioned, and then and of course it had its own problems. And but then later in later 70s, we ventured into setting up a system in collaboration with Boston University and Harvard University, in which you were all the time involved. I'm talking about the project of Leroy Jones. And Pakistan was one of the pioneer country in setting up the reform, public sector reform, and a successful public sector reform, to the extent that in early 1980s, our setup from Pakistan was invited to the World Bank to give a presentation as a model how to run public enterprise sector in other countries, in developing countries. If you recall, it was organized by Leroy Jones and Mary Shirley and all. Then comes the 80s, when not only that Pakistan became almost was on the forefront of the public sector reform, but it became some kind of a facilitator for improving the performance of public enterprises in number of public developing countries like Mexico, Philippines, Malaysia, and to the extent even to next door India. My question is, we have seen this story of success of 1980s, and then earlier the story of success in 1950s and 60s. Do you have some views and opinion? What has gone wrong now? Well, let me also interject that you see, in the meanwhile, when we were doing very well in reform of public sector, and our public sector was taken as a model in the developing countries, there comes the privatization policy, and it obviously made a lot of difference. And I have a big question in my mind, which has damaged more in Pakistan, the public sector, privatization, or nationalization. What is your view about this ups and downs of this situation?
Go ahead, Gus.
Okay. I think that competition is essential to preserve efficiency. We all work better if we know that if we don't work hard and efficiently, we will go out of business because of competition. So I have found from experience that public sector enterprises tend to be better at gaining government support to remain in business regardless of their efficiency. So that if you have a large public sector in fields where there is competition, you get a large number of zombie enterprises. That is, they're not dead and they're not alive. They continue in business through government protection, government subsidies, and above all, loans from government banks, which they do not repay, but which they increase over time as their interest is added to their principal. And they become a drag on the economy. And that's not because they can't be efficient, it's because they can survive even if they're not efficient. And therefore, I am not in favor of expanding public enterprises in sectors which are competitive. It's different for sectors where there's a natural monopoly. Then you cannot count on competition to enforce efficiency and progress. Then you have to count on other factors, and it doesn't make that much difference whether it is publicly owned or privately owned with a public sector supervisory function.
Good. Thank you. Let me ask General Farooq. General Farooq, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, please. Professor, this is Farooq. My question is in three parts. My first part is regarding your view that you objected, and rightly so, because we didn't have the ore as far as steel mill was concerned. But at that time, when you were opposing this, Japan at the same time was being encouraged for heavy industry, which has no ore at all. So why couldn't you balance the need at that time vis-a-vis fertilizer and heavy industry? Number two. Since the Economic Hitman book came out, we in the third world, the developing countries, have become very suspicious of the advisory groups. How much is the influence of such groups in letting us go astray from a definite path of progress? And my number three part of the question is, the galaxy in Pakistan of all the economists who are foreign trained have failed us up till now in taking off in the right direction. As an independent observer, what is your view? Why have they failed? And I don't want to name them. It's a whole galaxy. They are either in the government or they have been helping the government, but yet they have failed. Thank you.
Again, I have to plead some degree of ignorance, okay, of what has happened in Pakistan in the last 50 years. But please remember one thing. Ultimately, decisions are almost never made by economists. There are some periods when economists have been dominant, but the record during those periods is pretty good. Most of the time, the decisions are made by politicians, and they may or may not listen to economists. It often doesn't matter what economists say. The decisions are made on other grounds. Now, the extreme case, I can tell you, I was head of a team that was supposed to advise Egypt on industrial development. After we had done our work and handed in our report, the minister asked to see me privately, nobody else to be present. And when I came into his office, he said, Professor Papanek, you don't understand Egypt at all. And I said, yes, I could well believe that I didn't understand Egypt, but what did he have in mind specifically? Why did he say this? And he said, do you know how long a minister is in office in Egypt on average? And I said, no, I did not. He said, the average length of time in office for a minister is 6 months. Your recommendations all have costs in the short term and benefits in the long term. Tell me, give me one good reason why I should incur unpopularity so that my successor has gains favor from the benefits of the recommendations you have made. I said, that this way I could have given a good reason if you expected to be out of office by the time recommendations produced results. This is an extreme case, but the ultimate decisions are very rarely made by economists. Now, that doesn't mean that I think economists' advice is always right. There have been some stupid recommendations made by foreign economists and some stupid recommendations made by native economists. We don't always make the right decisions, the right recommendations. I personally made a very bad recommendation in Pakistan in the 1950s, which contributed to the overthrow of the government by the military. I didn't do this on purpose. I did it because I was ignorant of an important fact, and I gave the wrong advice. Um, Human beings always make mistakes. But I think on the whole, during the period that we were working in Pakistan from 1954 to 1970, with one exception, the advice was reasonably good. And even in retrospect, I think we saved Pakistan a waste of tremendous resources by delaying the development of the steel mill to a later stage. The big mistake we made was not appreciating the anger in the East Pakistan elite at the allocation of resources. We weren't fully aware of that, but neither were the Pakistani economists. It had nothing to do with our being foreigners. It had to do with nobody being fully involved in the thinking of the East Pakistan economists. That was a big mistake we made.
Mistake that you made that you're saying that led to the military takeover? What was that mistake that you were talking about?
I'm sorry?
You said that you gave some advice that kind of led to the takeover of the military. What was that advice?
Oh, it was this was in 1958 when I was the head of the Harvard Advisory Group for a brief period of time. And I worked very closely with the Ministry of Finance. And I urged the Ministry of Finance to deficit finance, to increase the development program by more than the resources available. And my argument was, first of all, Pakistan was growing, the economy was growing, and therefore required more money. So you could increase the money supply because there was an increasing demand for money. And so you can increase, you could have a deficit, which Pakistan had not run. Pakistan had followed the British tradition, colonial tradition of not running a deficit in the budget. And I said it was high time it did so for two reasons. Second, first, the increase in the money supply. Second, Pakistan was getting grain from the United States, both wheat and rice. So you were increasing the supply of basic agricultural commodities, which meant that the price would go down with the supply increase, and it would harm agricultural production. You wanted to stabilize the price by increasing the money supply, increasing demand as well as supply. I unfortunately succeeded in persuading my colleague from the Ministry of Finance, whom I remember well, but whose name I won't mention, to accept the idea of deficit financing, of having some running a deficit on the budget.
I hope you realize we've been very good students. Now we've got a 12% of GDP deficit.
Well, but
Let's stop 90%.
at that time it made sense, except neither he nor I knew that U.S. supply of wheat and rice had been interrupted for reasons having nothing to do with Pakistan. It had to do with something in Yugoslavia. And there was no wheat or rice coming in.
So what's your view on the economic hitman thesis?
I'm sorry.
What's your view? The question was asked on economic hitman. You know about the book, The Confessions of the Economic Hitman? The view was expressed that economic hitman, which is another way of saying aid dependence and dependence on economic consultants who run your policy. What's your view on that? Pakistan is said to be dependent on consultants from the get-go. And we still continue to be very aid dependent and consultant dependent.
But is it still true that Pakistan follows the advice of consultants currently? Look, there are two kinds of consultants: those who have money and those who don't. Those who have money have influence whether they are good or bad. Now, some of those consultants have ideological positions which they maintain regardless of the facts on the ground. So, for instance, the advice that the IMF gave at the time of the Asian financial crisis, which affected Pakistan, I believe, much less than it did the countries in Southeast Asia. The advice the IMF gave was largely wrong. But people listened to the advice because they were consultants with money. Consultants without money
they're useless.
You don't care because you think they are competent and very rarely are they listened to, in my experience.
Now, the part of the question was regarding your students, that economists in this country have totally failed. And majority of them have been your students or Harvard trained or trained by Boston. So what's your view on the fact that you trained so many people, Harvard trained so many people, Boston trained so many people, and they've come back and they have not added much to policy? What's your view on that?
Oh, I can't comment. I mean, I don't really know what role they have played. I know that they have played roles in different, under different governments in different directions, right? They have different views, and I can't tell whether they have given good advice or bad advice because I don't know what advice they have.
Doctor, can I make it simple? All these very well trained galaxy of people, you trained some of them, they have been, I said, part of either government or otherwise they have been advised the government. The net result of all this is where the mess we are in. So my question is, that you don't have to know them personally as to what advice they gave. The fact is that we are in a dire strait. So your students who are numerous in Pakistan and still abroad, whenever need be, they have been called in, they have failed us. Your comment.
Well, uh, it, it doesn't make any difference what what advice they have given. There are certain realities that they probably have not influenced one bit. Uh, the to people, I mean, my view in training people was that governments needed their own economists in order to deal with the international institutions that were playing a large role. I thought it was unfortunate that all the competence would be on the side of the World Bank, the IMF, and to a lesser extent the Asian Development Bank, and no competence of the same quality would be on the side of the governments that were dealing with these institutions, um, because they don't have all the wisdom. You want to have people who are from Pakistan dealing, advising government officials when they deal with the World Bank. Or
Dr. Saab, Professor, just have a look at it. Mr. Nadeem was Deputy Planning Chairman, Planning Commission for 3 years. Ishtar Hussain in every government has been an advisor. There are so many others one can name, yet we are in a dire state. So they have been part of government, they have been making policies, and yet we are into a deep hole.
You're absolutely right. Gus, let me amend that question a little bit. Let me add to that question. I think it's a very valid question and worth thinking about. One question that I sort of, as I said, amend to it. You remember the famous book by Valdez called Pinochet's Economists. And let's talk about it. And this is a kind of chart that has been made, that Harvard sent economists to us and to other countries, whereas Chicago sent economists to Chile and Latin America. Now, Chile has been a sterling success as opposed to Pakistan not being a success. Is that something to do with Harvard versus Chicago, or is that something else?
Sure. Well, Pakistan was a considerable success in the from 1958 to 1965. Was that because of Harvard? No, it was because Pakistan followed sensible policies and focused on development as the principal objective. Pakistan was not much of a success between 1965 and 1970. Was that because of Harvard? No, had very little to do with Harvard. It had to do with where the resources were allocated. Chile similarly has had periods of great success and periods of great failure. But it has consistently been managed, almost not consistently, but substantially, the economy has been influenced by Chileans who were trained at Chicago.
But you wouldn't say it's a difference between two models, that the Chilean Chicago model worked better than the Harvard model here. Is that conclusion one can draw?
No, I don't. If you, I would say the Harvard model, which there is no Harvard model. Uh, I think the Indonesia was a great success story from 1966, 67 until 1990, quite a long period of time, advised by people from Harvard. But it wasn't the people from Harvard that made it a success. They had sensible policies that were largely the design of Indonesians, with some help from the Harvard group. No advisors and no economists dominate policy making except during some periods of time in some countries. And on the whole, when economists have dominated policy making, they've done reasonably well.
Fair enough. Okay, let me take a few more questions very quickly. Moin Bartley.
Same views if we have sense.
Moin Bartley.
Sure. Thank you, Nadeem. Thanks, Professor Papanek. It's been fascinating listening to you. My question is about nationalization. You know, we often really sort of criticize it a lot, and obviously it has been damaging. But my question is that you know, in the 70s, the environment in the 70s was such that a number of developing countries, especially, you know, like for example in Latin America, were looking at a more socialist approach. And so is it really such a big blunder or such a big mistake to have done this in the 70s, or was it perhaps in keeping with the global sentiment at that time? And that's one question. And the other is that once we did that, then getting out of it, you know, I personally am a big fan of privatization, although obviously it has its challenges, but we've not really been able to get out of it fully either. So, you know, those are my two questions. One is nationalization, and the other is, you know, why haven't we been able to get out of it?
Yes, can I take all the questions together to give you a chance to answer them together rather than take one at a time? Is that okay?
So you want me to respond?
Did I take 2 or 3 questions and then you respond, or do you want to respond to each one?
Okay, go ahead. It was in the same subject. It doesn't make sense to bundle them. Let me quickly respond. I am planning to write an article on the subject of public ownership. I think that people who equate socialism with public ownership are not true Marxists because they don't accept the fact that Marx, like every other human being, is influenced by the time in which he lives. At the time when Marx was writing, there was no progressive income tax. There was no inheritance tax. There was no wealth tax. The only revenue for government was on trade, and it was very small. So he advocated public ownership in order to gain some control of resources and of influence. That is unnecessary nowadays. You don't need to have public ownership. You can get the same benefits from the progressive income tax, from excise taxes, from inheritance taxes, and so on. And public ownership, as I said, tends to undermine competition because public enterprises are not subject to the full effect of competition in the same way that private enterprises are. So I think they should be limited to natural monopolies and other fields where competition is not possible. And the Pakistan nationalization was a disaster to my mind because it took over reasonably well-functioning private banks, cotton gins, and other enterprises, and very often led to poor management. Privatization is always a hard thing to do. And once you've nationalized, you've made it very difficult to get private people to invest in the country because they're suspicious of whether they might be nationalized again. So it's been a real setback to Pakistan in my view. And it's unfortunate because it was done in order to help the poor, and by slowing growth, it damaged the poor. Other things would have been done better, but I think it was done at least in part for noble reasons, but it didn't achieve those.
Great. Manzoor sir? Manzoor Ahmed?
Okay. Professor, you have mentioned, you just said nationalization be one of the big disasters. And I think maybe one could say the two wars of 65 and 71 were the other. What other two factors you think were the key causes of Pakistan not doing well and falling behind after it started doing very well in the beginning? Thank you.
Well, I've mentioned the large share of resources that have gone to maintain some kind of balance in armed forces with India. You are engaged. This is not a popular thing to say, but you are engaged in a competition that is very difficult to maintain for Pakistan because of the relative size of the two countries. So in order to maintain some balance, you have to divert substantial resources to the military resources which are not available for other activities. And it's just, it's once you've made a decision that you are going to remain competitive with India in the military field, you have no choice but to spend substantial resources in maintaining that balance. And I have nothing to say about that. I mean, this is whether you want to do that or not is a national decision. And I don't think economists have any influence on it whatsoever. it's a decision that is not made in any way on the basis of economic advice. But yet it affects the economy significantly. Yeah. So that is the other. And the third reason is that Pakistan has, I believe, not competed successfully to the degree that it needs to in the international market. And that may have something to do, but this is now beyond my competence, because I would need to study and catch up on what has happened to Pakistan. But it's my impression that the exchange rate makes it difficult for Pakistan's textile industry to continue to compete in the world market. And that's going to be an increasing problem.
Anita Weiss? Professor Weiss.
Hi, thank you. Actually, Gus, this has been really fascinating and great listening to it. But I have a question going back to the Harvard Advisory Group. I mean, this is something I've read about, I've written about the shift of the national capital from Karachi to Islamabad. And I mean, usually when you have a national capital in the place that is the industrial center, it makes sense. But I'd like to hear your views of, number one, what was the Harvard Advisory Group thinking, existing simultaneously with the shift? And did you think this was a wise economic choice? I mean, I understand, we all know what the political implications, India bombing, bombing Karachi easily, but really, seriously, do you think that there was an economic impact on that decision, which took years and a great deal of money to move the national capital to Islamabad?
Good question. Yeah, go ahead.
It's an interesting question, but I should say right away, we had absolutely no role in this decision. That was made, there was no economic input, as far as I can tell, in this decision whatsoever.
But you must have had a thought about it while it was happening. What was you and others thinking about this?
Well, we had to say, in one sense, that the person who was involved in helping design Islamabad had been introduced to Pakistan as part of our team. And that he did a good job in designing how Islamabad would be developed. But I never, I must confess, I never much thought about this, because I knew we had no role in it. It was a decision that was made, and they didn't consult us. Not only did they not consult us, they didn't consult any economists.
You didn't analyze it like the steel mill.
Hmm?
You didn't analyze it like the steel mill.
No, you don't get involved in things that nobody wants you to get involved in. That's a total waste of time. Yeah, I mean, you want to work on those things where your work is useful. If a decision has been made which can't be changed, then why would you want to work on that when you can work on things where what you say may have some influence? You know, the credo of the advisor is, if something is stuck, let it be. If something moves, give it a push. If something moves rapidly, pat it as it goes by and claim the credit. That is the credo. So this is the decision on this move to Islamabad was something that was stuck. There was nothing you were going to do that made any difference.
Also, एक second. Faz Mohammed? Faz Mahmood? Faz Mahmood, quickly. No Faz Mahmood. Ahmed Durrani, then go ahead.
Yeah, I think I see Faiz, but sorry, thank you very much. Dr. Papanek, I just I sort of have a very similar question, but not about Islamabad, but given the time frame the Harvard group was there, I would also like to understand a bit about, since you came with the agricultural background, what were the views in terms of the Indus Basin Treaty and all that was happening on the Indus Cascade and the decisions made henceforth about building the dams, etc.? How did that figure in the larger scheme of things and your interaction with the government?
I didn't fully get the question, but you were asking about agriculture, right?
The Indus Waters Treaty. He was asking about the Indus Waters Treaty and the dams.
Oh, yeah. Again, we did not get involved at all. This was something that the World Bank was heavily involved in. They had plenty of good economists, and we and we knew this would ultimately be a decision of political bargaining. And to the extent that economists would play a role, it would be the World Bank's economists. We worked on some important things, both at the beginning and then in the 1960s, when we worked on how to use surplus agricultural commodities that came from the United States to expand the development program, and we came up with the notion of of locally developed projects that would be financed by the rupees generated by selling the surplus commodities. So you would increase the demand for these commodities at the same time that you increase the supply, but would you do it by developing a program of rural public works that was highly decentralized. This worked extremely well for a short period of time until it became politicized. But so that was something we developed and proposed, and which got implemented and was extremely useful. We did not work on the Indus Basin settlement, and all I know is what I read in newspapers. I don't have any special knowledge of that.
Gus, let me ask you another couple of very simple question. When you came in, you were virtually the only advisors in the country, so to speak, the Harvard Advisory Group. But pretty soon the World Bank came into play. The World Bank took a large share of the pie. And then, of course, there were Pakistani economists coming, like Mahbubullah had returned and some other returned.
Yes.
I would like you to sort of think about it. Was there any dialogue at all? Because that would be very interesting to us. Was there any dialogue at all between these 3 or 4 groups? Let's say one group was the Pakistani civil servants who were working very closely with the The other group was the newly returned economists like Mahbubullah and Khalid Ikram and all these guys who had come in. The third group was the World Bank people who had now begun to acquire prominence. And then there was the Harvard Advisory Group. Were you all in unison? Were there any debates? Were there any differences of opinion? Anything at all? Because they say if there are 2 economists, there are 20,000 debates.
Don't forget, the World Bank played no role in the early days of the Planning Commission and the Harvard Group. When we started in '54, there was no significant role for the World Bank. Then gradually, Pakistani economists came back. Muin Qureshi was the first one, and then Mahbub Haq, among others. And we worked very closely together. There was no, as far as I can tell, there was no difference of opinion. There were opinions that evolved. So, for instance, we accepted the concentration of income, power, and wealth that developed as a result of the Industrial Development Program. That seemed a necessary price to pay. When I wrote my book about Pakistan, I recognized this concentration, and I recognized the grievances of East Pakistan, but only to a degree, not very much. That wasn't a major theme of my book. The major theme was how Pakistan developed an industrial structure, and one that was quite efficient, able to compete in the world market. It was a remarkable achievement. That's what I concentrated on. When Mahbub Haq wrote his book, it was later, and by that time, the concentration was more important and he put it in a much more negative light, because the industrialization had been achieved. It had been achieved at a substantial cost, and he recognized the cost more than the achievement. I wrote earlier and I recognized more the achievement and less the cost. But there wasn't any disagreement between us that the concentration was.
For example, the issue of planning versus market never came up. For example, the issue of opening out and having a less directed economy never came up.
But look, the planning was never planning that told private sectors what to do. The
It did, because there were directed credit, there was licensing, there was import controls. So in a sense, it was controlling everything. It was telling the private sector what to do. You could only invest in textile. You couldn't invest in this. You had to do license for everything.
Yeah, but we were very much in favor. All of the plan itself was very much in favor of moving away from the license barrage to more market-driven economy. These were not conflicting views of the world. The Planning Commission and the plan documents did not advocate continuing import licensing. And by the time the plan was issued, I believe the export bonus voucher scheme was already in effect, which was very much market-driven exchange rate. It was freely traded, right? It was bought and sold. And it was a dual exchange rate. And you could buy whatever you wanted with it. With the
interesting thing is that all the economists of that time were agreed that controls were the better way to develop incentives. Like you said, private incentives, social goals. So the feeling of all the economists, World Bank, our economists, as well as yourself, were that we should give incentives to the local industrialists within a controlled framework, keep the economy controlled, keep the economy locked up, and have an import substitution system. That was kind of agreed amongst everybody. Is that right?
I didn't quite get it, but import substitution made obvious sense in a country that had no industry. But then Pakistan shifted quite early to a more export-oriented strategy, which relied on market incentives via the export bonus voucher scheme.
Okay, fair enough. Let me take the last question. Faiz Mahmood, are you going to take a question or not? Go ahead.
Sir, I represent Hashu Group, sir, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to join such an intellectual galaxy. Sir, my question is, in Pakistan, private sector participation by the government is always, it has been discouraged. There are so many private groups which want to invest in Pakistan. They have the bill and they do it. And one of the groups in which I am at the moment working as their chief, it is Hashu Group. We have, for example, in hospitality division, we have 11 five-star hotels. 5 more are coming up. And even today we signed an agreement of a 5-star hotel. But unfortunately, support by the almost zero. So what do you suggest, sir? Support the private sector so they can build up the weak economy of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gus, that's a question. I don't know if you want to answer it or not, but that's fine. Private sector needs to be supported and should be supported. But very quickly, can I ask you another question? Coming to when Mahbubullah came back, and Mahbubullah started his poverty curtain, and when Nurul Islam and the Bengali economists came back and they started establishing their Bangladesh thesis, then there was a kind of a vibrant debate within Pakistan. One on inequality, which is individual inequality, the other on regional inequality, right? And at that stage, Harvard Advisory Group was kind of marginalized, but the World Bank had come in strongly in the saddle, and the World Bank was kind of running policy there. What was the reaction in the Harvard group? Did you withdraw yourself, or was it the kind of arrangement with the World Bank, or did it just happen? How did it go?
I did not. You were asking about the World Bank.
What I'm saying is, by the 70s, the Pakistani economists had come in, Mehbubul Haq, Nurul Islam, etc. And there was a vibrant debate amongst them. And the centerpiece of the debate was inequality, on the basis of which Bhutto came into power. But by then, after the nationalization, Harvard Group virtually left by the 70s. And the World Bank had come in. And we a large project. Was the withdrawal of the Harvard Group voluntary, or did the World Bank kind of edge you out? How did it happen?
No, it had nothing to do with the World Bank. There was an attack on the Harvard Group by, I don't remember who. It was somebody in political opposition, and the charge was that we were all Jews, including Angus Madison, who is a Scotch Presbyterian. But anyway, the charge was that the Harvard Group was Jewish and was acting in the interests of Israel. And that made it politically, the attack, which was totally unjustified, made us a political liability and made it difficult for us to continue to work. And so by mutual agreement, we left. It had nothing to do with the World Bank. I don't remember, honestly don't remember who made this attack, but it was an attack on the government for having a group that was dominated by Jews.
My final question, Gus, let me ask you my final question. How is it that education did not play a major role in the early days of Pakistan while we were so busy building industry? I don't think we made the same kind of investment in education. And I don't think the Harvard Advisory Group interacted with academia. Did you interact with academia? Was there any academic economist that you could have interacted with or did interact with?
You asked me about the relative emphasis on an investment in education.
Education. I think the relative investment in education in the early days, in the first plan and second plan in the Harvard Advisory Group days, was relatively little, very little investment in education. And whereas in India, Nehru was building universities, we were not building any education. So I was asking, did the Harvard Advisory Group weigh in on that? And did you have anything to do with local academics?
With local?
Local academics, local economists in universities, if there were any.
This was not an area we were much involved in, and that was a mistake. It may have been a mistake. Maybe it wouldn't have made any difference to what Pakistan decided. I think you're quite right that there was a relative neglect of education. But keep in mind, you had a state that was fragile in the extreme. Yeah, you had a limited number of civil servants that came over. This was a new country that had to be built. You had no industry. That was our emphasis. So education was relatively neglected, but it would have, the resources were limited. A lot of it went into housing and other things for refugees. The number of Muslims who came into Pakistan about equal the number of Hindus who went to India. But India is a country that is 4.5 or 5 times as large as Pakistan in terms of the economy. So it was much easier to absorb the same number of refugees. Yes, not everything could be done in the early days. Maybe more should have been done, probably more should have been done with respect to education once
I ask also because
these were overcome, but we were not involved in that, and we didn't push for it, and that may have been a mistake.
There is an interesting difference, Gus, that I might point out. In Chile, for example, in Latin America, Harberger and Friedman pushed very hard. In fact, there's a communication between them and Dean, the famous Dean, who was the head of USAID at one point, where they insisted that they would deal with academia and not with civil service. And that paid off in a big way because they trained a whole cadre of economists in Latin America that even today, contrary to what General Farouk thinks, they even today are running Latin American policy. Even Mexico, for example, Chile and Brazil, everybody has Harberger, Friedman students who are doing very well. Do you feel that's an issue that needs to be thought through?
I did not get this, but I have a problem right now. I have another meeting at 2:00.
Thank you very much. I think you've been very kind. I think it's been wonderful.
You have lunch before, otherwise
no problem. We'll have another session with you. This was wonderful. I think you gave us a lot of insights. I think you really, really energized us on thinking more about how the early days of Pakistan happened and what policies happened and what we should think about. So Gus, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I'm sure everyone in the audience thanks you. They all remember you very fondly. You are always welcome in Pakistan. You're a good friend of Pakistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.